When you picture a Neanderthal, there is this very specific, almost, unshakable image that immediately pops into your head.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone has it.
Right. And you listening to this right now, you probably have it in your head too. It's that classic museum diorama image, the
Yeah.
primitive, heavily muscled caveman.
Draped in some kind of ragged fur.
Yeah, ragged furs, holding a crude club, looking, I don't know, a little confused by a spark of fire or something. We have this deeply ingrained cultural narrative that they were a lesser hominid.
An evolutionary rough draft, basically.
Exactly, a draft that got discarded, an intellectual dead end that modern, sophisticated humans just ultimately outsmarted and outcompeted.
And that linear story of progress, I mean, it is so foundational to modern anthropology. The underlying assumption is always that chronological age equals simplicity. Like,
Yeah.
we are the pinnacle of the tree, and they are just a broken branch. And we've been reinforcing that specific narrative for about 170 years now, pretty much ever since the first distinct fossil was pulled out of the Neander Valley in Germany back in 1856.
But what if, and this is why we're here today, what if every single assumption baked into that museum diorama is completely upside down? Today's deep dive is tailored specifically for you, the curious learner who, isn't afraid to take a foundational assumption and look at it through a completely unconventional lens.
The very unconventional lens, yeah.
So we are unpacking a massive stack of source materials today. We're pulling from genetics, from archaeology, ancient texts, and it's all centered around this alternative framework called the Unified Theory of Geologic History, or the UTGH.
Right.
And the mission of this deep dive is to see what happens when you take the exact same fossil and DNA evidence used by the standard model, but you apply a radically different starting premise.
Because the UKGH framework, it doesn't just throw out the physical evidence, right? It looks at the bones, it looks at the cave sites, the genomic data, all of it. But it argues that Neanderthals were not a separate, lesser species at all.
Not at all.
No. Instead, it posits that they were the direct descendants of the biblical Adam, specifically the lineage of Cain.
Which is just a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. And under this framework, far from being these, primitive grunting cavemen, they were actually master engineers. They were sophisticated artists, brilliant musicians, and they possessed incredibly complex social structures. And ultimately, they survived a global catastrophe.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the scope of that claim is just massive. So we're going to trace this lineage today from their pre-flood highland homes, and we'll explore the stunning evidence of how they actively engineered their environment. And finally, we're going to look at the genetic proof of their ultimate reunion with the rest of humanity.
It's quite a journey.
It is. And to start, I think we have to look at the physical body itself. Because the Neanderthal morphology, the heavy brow ridges, the robust frames, that physical shape is kind of the entire foundation of that primitive myth we just talked about.
Yes, what people point to first.
Right. But the sources argue that this wasn't a parallel evolutionary branch that, split off hundreds of thousands of years ago. They present these people as pre-flood humans who migrated into the extremely elevated, rocky terrain of the Caucasus-Zagros-Altai mountain corridor.
And that geographical shift, that is the key to understanding their physical appearance.
Yeah.
The UTGH relies on this biological concept called a front-loaded genomic architecture.
Front-loaded, meaning it's already in there.
Exactly. Instead of viewing the population as slowly accumulating random mutations over millions of years through trial and error, a front-loaded genome implies that the original pre-flood human population possessed this immense library of latent, built-in adaptive potential.
Okay, so it's kind of like, it's like a biological Swiss Army knife.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, if you live your whole life in a comfortable temperate valley, you might only ever pull out the main blade.
Right.
But the tools to survive extreme cold or high altitude, they are still sitting there, just folded up in your DNA, waiting for some kind of environmental trigger.
That analogy hits the mechanism perfectly. In a stable environment, those specific genetic tools just remain dormant. You don't need them. But when a subset of that population migrates into a region with extreme environmental stressors, so we're talking bitter cold, high altitude, heavy physical demands, low UV light.
Really harsh conditions.
Very harsh. The genome doesn't need to slowly invent new traits. It responds rapidly through epigenetics.
Yeah, that then switches.
Exactly. It flips existing genetic switches on or off, expressing this latent potential within just a few generations to ensure the survival of the group.
So we are talking about extreme rapid adaptation here, not an entirely different species. And let's actually deconstruct that morphology, because I think once you look at the biomechanics of the Neanderthal skeleton, it really stops looking like an ape and starts looking more like a specialized athlete.
A power lifter almost.
Yeah. Take the heavy brow ridges and the incredibly dense, thick bones. The standard model often uses that to say, look, they're primitive. But if you apply the biomechanical lens of Wolff's law, which is the principle that bone remodels and thickens in response to physical stress placed on it.
Which we see in athletes today, by the way.
Right. So those features suddenly make perfect engineering sense.
They absolutely do. If you are living this highly mobile life, right? Climbing, hunting, carrying heavy loads across really uneven, treacherous, rocky terrain, your skeletal architecture must adapt to bear that load.
It has to, or you break.
Exactly. The heavy muscle attachments, the broader joints we see in these skeletons, they're distributing the mechanical stress of a grueling highland lifestyle. And the brow ridges, specifically, they help dissipate the massive bite forces generated when they use their jaw as a third hand.
Oh, like to grip things.
Yeah, to grip or process tough materials like heavy hides, which we know from the tooth wear that they absolutely did.
That's fascinating. And the sources also spend a lot of time on their facial structure, specifically the enlarged nasal passages. Because again, the dioramas love to give them these wide, flat, primitive-looking noses, but functionally, those enlarged passages, they have these complex internal structures called turbinates.
Right.
And they basically act as an incredibly efficient biological HVAC system.
The thermal dynamics of that facial structure are just brilliant. I mean, think about it. If you are living in a high-altitude, near-glacial environment, drawing freezing air directly into your lungs can cause severe respiratory shock.
And massive heat loss.
Yes. So the enlarged nasal cavity with its increased surface area of mucosal tissue, it aggressively warms and humidifies that freezing mountain air before it ever reaches the delicate lung tissue.
Wow.
It is a highly engineered biological heater.
And I guess that ties directly into their broader thoracic cavities, too, like the classic barrel-shaped chests. Because if you're at high altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen is lower. Right, the air is literally thinner. So your body responds by expanding lung capacity, which logically requires a broader rib cage to actually house those larger lungs.
And it also requires an increase in hemoglobin production to transport what little oxygen is available. Plus, you get an alteration in body proportions. The cold environment actively selects for thermal retention.
Which means what exactly for their limbs?
We actually see this in modern high-latitude populations, too. It means heavier body mass with shorter distal limbs, meaning shorter forearms and lower legs.
Oh, to keep the heat in.
Right. It minimizes the surface area exposed to the cold, reducing overall heat loss. So when anthropology catalogs all these traits and labels them a distinct species called Homo neanderthalensis, the UTGH framework steps in and says, no, wait, these are simply the cold-adapted high-altitude expressions of the exact same human genome.
There was one human lineage, just expressing differently under radically different environmental pressures. And the sources tie this geographical isolation directly to the ancient texts, specifically the Genesis 4 account.
Yes, this is a crucial connection.
Because the framework places the pre-flood Eden in the Levantine interior, which means that when the text says Cain was exiled east of Eden, he was pushed into a very specific topography.
Right. If you map that out, east of that Levantine interior is the Zagros mountain system, which leads into the Iranian plateau and eventually the Altai Mountains extending into Asia.
It's a massive corridor.
That entire stretch is the pre-flood highland corridor. So the UTGH framework argues that Genesis isn't just speaking metaphorically here. It is naming a specific population, the line of Cain, that migrated progressively into these unforgiving highlands across multiple generations.
So while the other human lineage, Seth's line, which eventually leads to Noah, remained in the temperate, highly productive lowlands where life was, frankly, less physically demanding.
A lot easier, yeah.
Cain's lineage was forced to become these robust, hyper-adapted highland specialists. I mean, this wasn't just any random group of hunter-gatherers. What archaeology has been calling Neanderthals, what modern genomics calls the corridor population, and what Genesis calls the line of Cain are, according to this source material, 3 different labels for the exact same isolated family.
And that synthesis of the disciplines is really the core of the whole framework.
Yeah.
And it dramatically changes how we evaluate their intelligence, too. Because if they possess a front-loaded human genome, their cognitive capacity is identical to ours.
Right. which means we really need to look at how they interacted with their environment. The old cliche, is that they just stumbled around until they found a hole in the rock, huddled inside, and maybe banged two stones together if they were lucky.
Just shivering in the dark.
Exactly. But the archaeological evidence completely shatters the myth of the randomly squatting caveman. The sources go into so much detail about what they call habitation engineering.
Because they were not passively occupying natural shelters. They were actively modifying them into structured homes. But, before we look at the modifications, the UTGH framework introduces a pretty crucial caveat about the caves themselves.
Oh, right, the timeline of the caves.
Right. The framework argues that the massive limestone cave systems we associate with Neanderthals in places like Europe and the Middle East, they're actually a post-flood phenomenon.
Now, I had to read that section twice, I'll be honest, because it challenges a major, major assumption. If they were pre-flood highlanders and these limestone caves didn't exist yet, where were they living?
Well, in the pre-flood world, the UTGH suggests they were living on and among the ancient exposed Creighton basement rock. So we're talking about the extremely hard granites and gneisses that formed the core of the continents.
Okay, so hard rock, not limestone.
Exactly. The massive limestone deposits we see today, according to the UTGH, are the carbonates that precipitated out of the enormous volumes of mineral-rich seawater that washed across the continents during the catastrophic global rupture event.
Okay, so the limestone is essentially chemical fallout from the floodwaters, meaning these vast karst cave systems were formed rapidly, either during or immediately after the catastrophe.
That's the model, yes.
And so the survivors of this highland lineage, they retreat into these newly formed, relatively soft limestone formations to survive the brutal post-flood climate crash. And when they move in, they aren't acting like frightened animals. They're applying pre-flood engineering knowledge to this new environment.
Exactly. They were looking at these spaces structurally. Like, let's look at Abric-Romaní in Spain. Excavators found something there that just completely upends the primitive narrative.
What did they find?
At the drip line, which is the threshold of the cave entrance where the rain falls, archaeologists uncovered carbonized wood fragments set into the ground in a very distinct pattern. These were the remains of wooden poles that had been deliberately erected.
They were building walls.
They were constructing wind barriers.
And the sources point out they were building them specifically to choke off the cold air infiltration from outside, which, that requires a real understanding of thermal dynamics and airflow. You don't just build a windbreak unless you are actively trying to control the microclimate of your living space.
Right, it's intentional environmental control.
Yeah.
And we see that same mastery of thermal dynamics inside the caves, too. Look at Kabara Cave in Israel. The hearths discovered, they're not just, scorch marks on the ground where someone dropped a burning branch.
They're actual structures.
They are constructed, fixed surfaces with structured ash accumulations, indicating sustained generational use. And more importantly, they're positioned strategically in relation to the cave's geometry.
The sources mention that positioning was critical to maximize heat radiation while allowing the smoke to vent naturally out of the cave. And, anyone who has ever tried to build a campfire under a rocky overhang knows how incredibly difficult it is to not just smoke yourself out.
It's awful.
It requires empirical observation. You have to understand how the thermal mass of the rock absorbs heat and how the draft actually pulls the exhaust.
What's fascinating here is that it is calculated environmental management. And that level of planning extends to how they utilize the floor space, too. Across dozens of excavated sites, archaeologists consistently find deliberate intrasite spatial partitioning.
They have floor plans.
They maintain strict floor plans. Sleeping areas, which sometimes show microscopic evidence of prepared plant bedding, by the way, are consistently isolated from the butchery zones. And the tool production areas, where, shartstone flakes would be scattered all over, those are kept completely separate from the living quarters.
Which makes sense. You don't want to step on sharp rocks where you sleep. But to maintain designated zones for sleeping, butchering, and crafting, you have to have shared behavioral conventions. You can't just have one genius in the tribe who likes to keep his bed clean.
Right, the whole group has to agree on the floor plan.
Exactly. They have to communicate those boundaries and enforce them across generations. That implies complex language and a highly structured society.
The social contract required to maintain those spaces is inherently human. But if you want to see the absolute pinnacle of their engineering capabilities, the site that forces the hardest reassessment of their cognition We have to look at the monumental architecture of Brunicle Cave in southwestern France.
Oh, Brunicle is just stunning. When I was reading the breakdown of the site in the sources, I actually paused because the implications are so staggering. The sources describe this as a deliberate expedition deep into total darkness.
It is a literal underground architectural marvel. Deep inside the Brunicle Cave system, exactly 336 meters from the entrance, researchers found a massive, deliberate construction.
336 meters.
Yes, and it is composed of over 400 carefully broken stalagmite pieces, systematically transported and arranged into two rough annular or circular structures, and they're reinforced with supplementary piled segments to hold them up.
I mean, think about the physics and the logistics of that for a second. 336 meters deep. That is a third of a kilometer underground. The cave twists and turns. There is absolutely zero ambient light down there.
None. Pitch black.
In order to even reach that chamber, they had to engineer reliable, long-lasting light sources. We are talking about managed torches or fat lamps. And they had to maintain that lighting while simultaneously breaking off multi-ton pieces of rock, transporting them, and organizing them into a specific architectural vision.
The logistics demand organized labor. I mean, you do not accidentally wander a third of a kilometer into pitch blackness and accidentally assemble 400 stalagmites into geometric shapes.
No, definitely not.
It requires an architect, a labor force, and a sustained supply chain for fuel and lighting.
Yeah.
It is absolute proof of complex, purposeful design.
But this is where the timeline gets highly contested, right? Because the standard model places a deep time date on Brunicle Cave. They date it to about 176,500 years ago, which places it deep in the Neanderthal era, long before any accepted modern human presence in Europe. Now, I was digging into how they arrived at that number. They didn't use radiocarbon dating, right? Because there isn't enough organic material left.
Right, radiocarbon maxes out way before that.
Okay, so they used uranium-thorium dating on the calcite that eventually grew over the structures. But the UTGH framework heavily critiques this method. If I'm understanding the physics here, the UTGH argues that the catastrophic global flood completely scrambled the chemical clock.
That is the crux of the geochemical debate here.
Yeah.
So uranium-thorium, or UIR dating, works by comparing the ratio of two isotopes. Uranium is soluble in water, thorium is not.
Okay.
So under slow, uniform, everyday conditions, water dripping into a cave carries uranium but leaves the thorium behind.
Mm-hmm.
The uranium then slowly decays into thorium over time. By measuring how much thorium is in the calcite today, the standard model calculates the age.
But that entirely assumes a slow, peaceful drip over hundreds of thousands of years.
Precisely. And the UTGH framework argues that during the global rupture event, the mechanics were anything but peaceful. You have massive, chaotic mixing of superheated subcrustal fluids, ocean water, and dissolved minerals just surging through the crust.
A giant chemical soup.
Yes. And this violent chemical soup created wild disequilibria. It forced initial chemical imbalances of uranium and thorium into the freshly deposited post-flood limestone that mimic the appearance of immense age.
So the youth day isn't reflecting elapsed time. It is reflecting the violent chemical anomaly of the floodwaters that formed the cave in the first place.
Exactly.
Meaning those structures aren't 176,000 years old. They were built in the turbulent early centuries right after the flood, inside a newly hollowed-out karst cave by the surviving Highlanders who were applying their pre-flood architectural genius to a new, dark environment.
The structures are a survival adaptation, utilizing the only durable building material available in the deep cave. And the cognitive leap required to engineer a 336-meter deep cave system, coordinating labor, managing light, planning architecture, that same neurological hardware is what allows a population to think symbolically.
Right.
If you can build a complex annular structure in the dark, you can conceptualize abstract art.
Which perfectly bridges us into their society. Because for decades, the dogma was that Neanderthals simply didn't make art. That the capacity for abstract, symbolic representation, taking a thought from your mind and encoding it physically on a wall, that was supposed to be an exclusively modern human upgrade.
That was the hard line for a very long time.
But the sources highlight La Roche-Cotard Cave in the Loire Valley of France as the definitive end to that debate.
La Roche-Cotard is undeniable proof of symbolic cognition. In a gallery that was entirely sealed off by natural sediment deposition thousands of years ago, researchers discovered deliberate abstract symbolic markings on the soft walls.
What kind of markings?
We were looking at parallel dotted lines, carefully finger-traced triangular shapes, circular patterns in organized linear engravings.
And because the cave was completely sealed, there is no ambiguity about who made them. They are definitively associated with Neanderthal occupation. These aren't random scratches from a cave bear sharpening its claws. They are deliberate geometric patterns created by human fingers applying consistent pressure to form shapes.
It requires an aesthetic sense and a desire to leave a permanent mark. And the UTGH framework predicts exactly this. A lineage whose material culture was already highly sophisticated before the flood, preserving fragments of their artistic traditions on the walls of their post-flood shelters.
But if we're talking about sophisticated traditions, the artifact that truly blew my mind in the source material is the Divje Babe flute from Slovenia, a musical instrument. The sources dive incredibly deep into the acoustic analysis of this object, and it fundamentally changes how we have to view these people.
The Dibji Babe artifact is incredible. It's a section of a juvenile cave bear femur that has been artificially modified with drilled holes aligned along its length. Now, for years, the standard model tried to dismiss this as pseudoscientific wishful thinking.
Of course.
The prevailing counter theory was that a carnivore, like a wolf or a hyena, just happened to chew on the bone in a perfectly symmetrical way, puncturing holes with its teeth.
Right, because admitting it as a flute means admitting Neanderthals had a codified understanding of music, which breaks the primitive caveman rule. But I was reading the acoustic tests they ran in the 2010s. They didn't just look at the bone, they built exact replicas and tested the physics of the sound. And the carnivore theory just completely falls apart under that scrutiny, doesn't it?
The physics make the carnivore theory virtually impossible. When researchers analyzed the internal bore geometry of the bone, the specific spacing of the holes, and the deliberate modification of the mouthpiece, they found an instrument engineered for specific sound production.
And what happened when they played it?
When played by a musician, those exact hole placements consistently produce musical tones that align with a diatonic scale.
A diatonic scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. The foundational scale of Western music.
Yes.
You do not get a mathematically precise diatonic scale because a wolf accidentally bit a bone 4 times in a straight line. That is applied acoustic engineering. They understood pitch, interval, resonance, and they specifically manipulated a dense bare bone to produce those frequencies.
It is an engineered wind instrument, period. And under the UTGH framework, it is a profoundly significant artifact because it forms a direct bridge back to the Genesis 4 record.
Oh, so?
The ancient text doesn't just list a bunch of names. It explicitly identifies Cain's descendants as the founders of specific intellectual disciplines. It names a man named Jubal as the father of all such as handle the harp and organ, which translates to stringed and wind instruments.
So, the ancient text explicitly claims this specific genetic lineage codified the discipline of complex wind instruments. And then, thousands of years later, we dig into the very mountain corridor where the text says they migrated, and we pull out a masterfully engineered wind instrument associated with their physical remains.
The corroboration is astonishing.
It really is. But the text also makes another massive claim about Cain's line. It memes Jubal's half-brother, Tubal-Cain, as the instructor of every artificer in bronze and iron, metallurgy.
Right.
Now, this is where I have to push back a little, or at least ask the obvious question that the listeners are probably shouting at their screens right now. If these people were master metallurgists, working with advanced bronze and iron before the flood, where are all the metal tools? Why do we only ever find stone hand axes and flint scrapers at Neanderthal sites?
That is the most common and arguably the most important critique of this framework.
Yeah.
But it comes down to understanding the brutal reality of preservation bias and the chemistry of oxidation. The conditions required to preserve ancient metallurgy over thousands of years are incredibly demanding.
Because stone is effectively eternal, but metal wants to return to the earth.
Exactly. A stone hand axe is just rock. You can bury it in wet mud for 10,000 years, and when you dig it up, it still looks and functions exactly like a hand axe. But metals are highly reactive. Bronze oxidizes and breaks down. Iron is even worse. It rusts completely through, chemically dissolving back into iron oxide powder.
It just disappears.
Yes. Unless a metal artifact is deliberately placed in a highly specific, arid, sealed burial environment like, say, an Egyptian tomb, it simply will not survive millennia of exposure to ground moisture, acidic soil, and oxygen.
So the lack of metal isn't proof they didn't have it. It's proof of the physical limits of the material. But what about the fact that they clearly manufactured millions of stone tools? Does the framework suggest they just lost their metallurgical knowledge?
The framework suggests a severe supply chain collapse. Think about the post-flood world. The pre-flood mining infrastructure, the smelting furnaces, the massive open-pit mines, all of it was destroyed, buried under miles of catastrophic sediment.
Everything was wiped out.
Exactly. The survivors hiding in the highland caves might have brought a few iron knives or bronze tools with them, but over the early centuries, those tools broke, wore down, or rusted away.
And you can't just walk outside and build a new iron smelter when the global climate is collapsing and you're just trying to keep your family from freezing. You experience a materials regression. You don't lose your intelligence. You adapt to the materials that are abundant and immediately available, which is stone.
You apply your advanced geometric and engineering principles to the flint and chert you find in the limestone. The sophisticated multi-step level-off flaking technique they use to create stone tools isn't primitive. It's a complex algorithm of striking angles that maximizes the yield of sharp edges from a single core.
So even their stone tools show advanced engineering.
Yes, it is the work of an engineer forced to use stone. And interestingly, the framework notes that the bronze and ironworking attributed to Kane's line doesn't disappear completely. It is carried through the post-flood bottleneck by these survivors, which is why we see highly organized metallurgical traditions suddenly reemerging in the early post-flood Near East, specifically the Anatolian bronze-working traditions.
Oh, wow. It's a surviving technological memory of a lineage that had been working metal for centuries. The pieces fit together remarkably well when you shift the paradigm. So what does this all mean? We have this brilliant, highly adapted, technologically capable society of artists, musicians, and engineers living in the Rocky Highlands. The ultimate question is, what happened to them when the global flood hit? Because the narrative we always hear is Noah on the Ark. How does an entire secondary population survive a planetary catastrophe?
Well, under the UTGH framework, they didn't survive on a boat. They survived by geographic isolation and extreme elevation. The framework models the onset of the flood, the rupture of the fountains of the Great Deep, as initiating near the Iceland-Britain intersection of the mid-oceanic ridge system.
Okay, so a massive tectonic rupture.
Yes, this catastrophic tectonic event sent massive continent-sweeping tsunamis and unbelievable volumes of sediment-laden seawater surging across the global land masses.
But the Cainite lineage, the populations expressing the Neanderthal and Denisovan morphologies, they were already deeply entrenched in the highest elevations of the Zagros-Caucasus-Altai corridor.
That topography saved them. When the massive inundation arrived, the absolute highest peaks of these specific mountain ranges remained above the primary catastrophic floodline. Now, the communities living in the lowland valleys, the coastal settlements, they were completely wiped out.
But the highlanders?
But the high-altitude workshops, the deepest, most remote mountain communities, the individuals who just happened to be at extreme altitude when the ocean swelled, they survived.
They survived the water, but they inherited a broken world. They were isolated, traumatized, and thrust into a radically unstable post-flood environment characterized by massive volcanic ash clouds, plunging global temperatures, and atmospheric chaos. And I guess that is what drove them down into the newly forming limestone cave systems we talked about earlier.
Their survival was brutal, and their physical and genetic isolation deepened. With the lowlands destroyed, there was no outside genomic input for centuries. So the epigenetic expression of their cold climate, highland morphology, the heavy brows, the robust frames, it just became more pronounced, locking in the physical traits we now identify as Neanderthal.
Meanwhile, as they are surviving in the caves, the framework points to the other lineage. The Sethite line, Noah and his family survive on the Ark. The UTGH chronology places the flood event at approximately 3,298 BC. And where does the text say the Ark landed? The mountains of Ararat.
Which is incredibly significant geographically. The Ararat region is directly adjacent to the Caucasus Highland systems.
They are practically next door.
The two surviving pockets of humanity are literally deposited right next door to each other, though separated by rugged terrain and post-flood instability.
The sources outline a very specific time frame for what happens next, referring to the Peleg window. So fast forward to roughly 531 years after the flood, right around 2767 BC. The Earth's tectonics are stabilizing, the extreme post-flood ice age is beginning to shift, and the descendants of Noah, who have been multiplying and building their numbers in the productive valleys around Ararat, they begin to disperse outward.
Looking for new land.
Right. They follow the natural topography, moving into the highland corridors, expanding their territory, and as they move through those mountain passes, they encounter someone.
They encounter the descendants of Cain, the Highlanders. It is one of the most profound moments in human history. reconstructed through genetics and geography.
Imagine that encounter for a second. It's a family reunion on a species-wide scale. Two branches of a human family separated by centuries of time, extreme geographical isolation, and a planetary apocalypse, suddenly coming face to face.
And they look very different.
They do. The Highland survivors possess this intense, robust, cold-adapted morphology. Their languages have drifted significantly. Much like the difference between modern Germanic and Romance languages today, they probably could barely understand each other at first. But beneath the physical adaptations, they are undeniably human.
They recognize the humanity in each other. And this is where the UTGH framework diverges sharply from the standard evolutionary narrative. The standard model often implies a subtle, long-term genocidal war where the superior Homo sapiens gradually outcompete and replace the lesser Neanderthals, driving them to extinction.
A sort of prehistoric survival of the fittest.
Exactly. But the genomic data tells a completely different story. They didn't wipe each other out. They did what human populations almost always do when they meet and interact over time. They reintegrated the intermarried. The two fractured lines merged back into one.
And we know this for an absolute, undeniable fact because the proof of that reintegration is literally inside the cells of the people listening to this right now. Let's dive into the modern genomics because this is where the theory locks into hard science. Every person of non-African descent alive today carries roughly 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome.
The standard model views that 1 to 4% as the result of modern humans migrating out of Africa, bumping into a completely separate archaic hominin species, interbreeding briefly, and then watching that archaic species die off.
Right.
But the UTGH framework reads that exact same genomic data through the lens of this post-flood geographic reunion. And it makes a highly specific testable prediction that the standard model often struggles to explain clearly. It's called the corridor prediction.
I want to make sure I map this out correctly for our listeners. Because there wasn't just one localized group of highlanders. The pre-flood highland terrain was immense. It stretched from the Caucasus Mountains in the west, across the Zagros Mountains, and all the way to the Altai Mountains in the far east.
That massive expanse is the key. Because the population stretched across it, the framework identifies two distinct regional branches of this survivor population. In the western portion, the Caucasus corridor, you have the population expressing the morphological traits we call Neanderthal. Okay. In the eastern portion, the Altai corridor, you have a population expressing a slightly different set of traits, which modern science calls the Denisovan morphology.
So you essentially have the western Cainites and the eastern Cainites. And the UTGH predicted exactly where the genetic signatures of these two groups should end up in modern human populations today, based entirely on how Noah's descendants dispersed from the Ararat landing site.
The geographic logic is beautifully simple. If Noah's descendants are expanding outward from Ararat, the groups migrating west, heading into what is now Europe and the Middle East, have to physically travel through the western Caucasus corridor.
Right, they have to pass through.
Therefore, they must encounter the Neanderthal communities, intermarry, and absorb the Neanderthal genetic signature. Conversely, the groups migrating east, heading toward Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas, would travel along the eastern Altai corridor. They would encounter the Denisovan communities and absorb that specific genetic signature.
And when geneticists actually sequence modern human populations today, what does the map look like? It matches the corridor prediction perfectly. European and Middle Eastern populations carry the highest concentrations of Neanderthal admixture, with almost zero Denisovan. Meanwhile, Melanesian, South Asian, and East Asian populations carry significantly higher Denisovan admixture.
The geographic complementarity is undeniable. The further your ancestors traveled along the eastern corridor toward the Pacific, the higher your Denisovan signal becomes. The map drawn by modern DNA sequencing is the exact map predicted by the post-flood migration routes through those specific mountain corridors.
There is a really specific detail in the sources regarding the Melanesian populations. So, people native to places like Papua New Guinea, their genome shows a massive spike carrying both Neanderthal and Denisovan signals simultaneously. And the framework explains this perfectly through geography.
How so?
Well, the Altai region, where the eastern corridor bends southward toward Southeast Asia and the Pacific, acts as a geographic funnel. Populations navigating that specific route would have passed through the edge of the western zone, picking up the baseline Neanderthal signal, and then traveled the entire length of the eastern corridor, heavily absorbing the Denisovan signal before finally pushing out into the Pacific Islands.
The genome literally traces their footsteps. But there is another layer to the genetic evidence that supports the UTGH timeline, specifically regarding the speed of this reunion. The standard model suggests tens of thousands of years of slow, diffuse, occasional interbreeding.
Right.
The UTGH argues for a rapid, concentrated reintegration during the Peleg window, and the evidence for this lies in something called haplotype block lengths.
This gets a bit into the genetic weeds, but the underlying physics of it is brilliant. I was trying to wrap my head around haplotype blocks, if I've got this right. It has to do with how our DNA recombines during reproduction. Think of a genome like a freshly opened, perfectly sorted deck of playing cards.
Okay, I like that.
When two completely distinct, isolated populations interbreed for the very first time, the DNA from the introgressing population, the Neanderthals, in this case, enters the offspring's genome in massive, unbroken sequences, whole suits of cards.
That is the perfect way to visualize the mechanism of meiosis. In that first generation of admixture, the child inherits enormous, intact chunks or blocks of pure Neanderthal DNA. But with every single generation that passes, the genome goes through recombination.
The deck gets shuffled.
Exactly. The deck gets shuffled. Those massive unbroken blocks of Neanderthal DNA get spliced, crossed over, and broken down into progressively smaller and smaller fragments.
So, the physical size of those surviving haplotype blocks in modern DNA acts like a highly accurate generational clock. If you look at a modern genome and the Neanderthal DNA is shattered into thousands of tiny microscopic fragments, it means a massive amount of time has passed, or the interbreeding was a slow, continuous trickle over millennia.
But that is not what the data shows. When geneticists analyze the Neanderthal haplotype blocks preserved in modern European and Asian genomes, they find that the blocks are surprisingly large.
Really large.
Yes. The preservation of these long sequences indicates a highly concentrated, very recent admixture event. The deck simply hasn't been shuffled enough times to support the deep time narrative of 50,000 years of slow integration.
Wow.
The large haplotype blocks align perfectly with a rapid, concentrated genetic bottleneck, a mass reintegration of the two lineages occurring exactly where and when the UTGH framework places the Peleg window expansion.
It is mathematical proof written right into the code. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it fundamentally and permanently changes the narrative of human history. This is no longer a story of Homo sapiens, the superior evolutionary winner, conquering the globe and leaving the primitive hominids to freeze in the dark.
No, not at all.
It is the story of a fractured family. It is a single, deeply complex humanity torn apart by geography and an unimaginable catastrophe, eventually finding its way back together to become whole again.
It is a profound paradigm shift. It forces us to confront our own chronological arrogance. The genome remembers what written history forgot. It remembers that both human lineages survived the flood. Both lineages contributed their strength, their adaptations, and their genius to the rebuilding of the post-flood world.
They built it together.
Yes. The humanity that repopulated the Earth wasn't just the pristine descendants of Noah. It was a united humanity, permanently carrying the physical and intellectual legacy of the Highland survivors.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We've taken a stack of anomalies that never quite fit the standard narrative, from a 336-meter-deep architectural wonder built in a lightless cave, to a beautifully engineered flute carved from a bare bone playing a diatonic scale, to the specific geographic map of genetic codes sitting inside the cells of every person listening to this right now.
It's a lot to process.
It is. And we viewed all of it through the lens of the UTGH framework. Under this lens, the Neanderthal is completely transformed. They are no longer an evolutionary dead end to be mocked in a museum diorama. They are resilient, brilliant survivors of extreme environments who weathered a global apocalypse.
They were master engineers who manipulated thermodynamics, artists who conceptualized abstract symbolism, and the preservers of ancient pre-flood technologies. They were, in every meaningful sense, our family.
So why should you, the listener, care about any of this? Because this history isn't just buried under a stalagmite in France or trapped in a fossilized bone in Slovenia. It is written in your very biology. That 1 to 4% of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA you likely carry isn't the mark of a primitive, grunting caveman ancestor. It is the inherited legacy of master engineers, musicians, and survivors. It proves that humanity's story is far more complex, far more rapid, and far more deeply connected than the textbooks often realize.
It challenges us to look at the evidence of the past with fresh eyes, recognizing that survival requires an immense amount of intelligence, and that ancient absolutely does not mean simple.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We spent a lot of time talking about the physical and genetic survival of this lineage. We know from the ancient texts that the Canaanite line brought their pre-flood mastery of music, metallurgy, and architecture into the Highland Mountains. If those brilliant survivors brought that highly advanced knowledge through the catastrophe and then fully reintegrated with Noah's descendants during the Peleg window, how much of the sudden explosion of civilization we see in the archaeological record, the almost overnight appearance of complex cities, monumental architecture, and advanced writing in places like Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley just a few thousand years ago, how much of that is actually just the reawakening of their ancient preserved genius? What else did they remember that we are still using today, completely unaware of the mountain survivors who really invented it?